I mean, bottom line is like I don't like all this finger pointing at I again, not pro-Russian, but like our shit stinks real fucking bad.
I'll get into our shit in Ukraine in just a little bit. Yeah.
Yes, and we went off on a beautiful tangent, but we're back on track. We're reset. We're refocused. We've talked our shit, and now we were previously at, I believe, Bush, Clinton, Russia not being allowed into NATO, and now I think we're ready to do that deep dive into the Ukrainian side.
Yeah.
What is Ukraine? What's going on? What's going on with some of the atrocities that they have created in Donetsk and
Luhansk.
Thank you, Luhansk. What's going on with the Russian separatist movement? Is this fucking real? Is it a lie? Let the people hear. Let the miners of intelligence
hear. So this
hear.
is the part that I'm particularly knowledgeable about. So just by way of background, Ukraine, we don't need to go back into like the Middle Ages, but Ukraine used to be a part of the Russian Empire before it was Soviet. They are ethnically similar, but they have a separate language. Although the language is mutually understandable, right? Like it's sort of like speaking between Romance languages. So like between like French and Portuguese, or like Spanish and Portuguese or something. Most people in Ukraine understand both, or speak one. They speak one or the other, understand both, or they speak both. So it was a part of the Russian Empire for many years. The Russians suppressed their language and treated Ukraine very badly, like a backwater. Then comes the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks need allies, and so they sort of allow and encourage a Ukrainian bloom, a bloom of Ukrainian nationalism, because the Bolsheviks are fighting their own civil war against the Russian whites. And so they tell the Ukrainians, okay, you can have your leaders, you can have your culture, but you got to help us. After the civil war is over and Stalin takes over, that ends, of course. Stalin brings down the hammer, and Ukraine gets once again folded up back into the Soviet Union. And it becomes very Soviet, particularly in those areas, which you mentioned, the Donbass region, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, because they were industrial areas. So since they were industrial areas, they had a lot more people traveling from Moscow and from the universities to work there. And specifically Crimea, Sevastopol is the city which has a port. And since it was around the Black Sea, it was also a resort town. So that area is also very, very Russian. They're Russian speakers mainly. So everything continues. The Soviet Union falls apart in 1991. And in 1991, Ukraine declares independence. But right away, right at like the highest moment of jubilation in independence, where they vote on it, and almost every single state returns part. They call them oblasts, which are provinces. Every single oblast in Ukraine votes like 80-90% for independence. Crimea only votes 53%. So even at this like, wow, we're free moment, Crimea is like, hey, wait a second, do we want to be part of Ukraine? And it's 53%, and they do a conditional independence, which means that Crimea is going to be an autonomous republic. It's going to have its own constitution, its own president, and all that. And in the 90s, Ukraine does away with that. They throw away the independent president, but Crimea remains semi-autonomous and still has some rights that the other regions don't. So the 90s is in Ukraine, it's mostly concerned with like getting rid of communist influence, right? It's making sure the communists don't come back. By the 2000s, that's no longer the important, political division, right? It's no longer like reformers and liberals and conservatives and whatnot versus Bolsheviks. That's over. Soviet Union is not coming back. And by this point, they've grown rich. You start to see the oligarchs, right? Like people who used to be leaders in communities or businessmen turn to oligarchs. And all of a sudden, these oligarchs begin disagreeing with each other. So now you have the start of political parties and strong political disagreement in Ukraine. And so in 2000, there are two revolutions in Ukraine which are very important to understand now. Actually, before we get to the revolutions, just another division. So part of what I speak about this Ukrainian culture war is between the East and the West, right? Eastern Ukraine is Russian-speaking, majority. And these are Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Those are the areas that are now the rebel areas, the autonomous zones. They're the independent states, and Crimea is part of Russia. They're Russian speaking, and traditionally they look to Russia. They look to Russia for leadership. They look to Russia for business, oil, whatever. They want to be part of the larger Russian world. Russia has its own version of the European Union free trade thing, where it's got like a bunch of its states that can trade amongst each other. And traditionally, Russia has subsidized Ukraine with a lot of oil. So they prefer their Russian past. And meanwhile, you have Western Ukraine, which faces the European Union, and they're more liberal. They're more of a fan of like democratizing, let's say, escaping this like post-Soviet sleaze. All these Soviet countries are very sleazy and are sort of, are we democratic, are we not, very corrupt. So a lot of these people, they look to the European Union as a chance to march forward into that future, which liberalism has promised. And they're also primarily majority Ukrainian speaking.
Yep.
And so these two parts start having political disagreements and forming political parties that disagree about economics, the future of Ukraine, candidates, language. Language is a very big thing. So when Ukraine went independent, there was a policy of something called Ukrainianization, which was the closing down of schools that taught primarily in Russian and teaching everything in Ukrainian. When there was a coup in 2014, one of the first things that happened was the repeal of a law that said that the oblast, the provinces, could have a second official language if 10% of the people in that province spoke that language. And when the liberals or reformers, whatever, the anti-Russians came to power in 2014, the first thing they did was repeal that law. Part of the culture war, for example, is this figure of Bandera, who was a World War II Ukrainian nationalist who allied with the Nazis and also was an anti-Semite because he hated the Soviet Union so much that he wanted them gone. Now, at some point when he tried to declare independent Ukraine, the Nazis put him in jail, but still, right? Like, this is somebody who allied with the Nazis. The Russians fought the Great Patriotic War. This is like their moment of like highest achievement, of glory, of sacrifice. And to say that one of your national heroes now is going to be a Nazi sympathizer is sort of spitting in the graves of their ancestors. So when you see like, it's similar to how Northern people don't like how when statues of Robert E. Lee come up, that type of thing. When statues of Bandera started coming out in Western Ukraine and people started seeing his picture in government offices and stuff like that, well, Eastern Ukrainians didn't like that. So it's a similar culture war situation over language and over future and over past, similar to what we got going on here, going on over there. If you want to interject before I get into 2004 and 2014, feel free.
I'm going to interject, right? I'm going to just break this down a little bit more. So when you have Putin coming on and address those regions and saying, we're doing this this is all part of propaganda, but maybe they've seen pictures of this guy that is a Nazi and they're like, what the fuck? What is this country devolved? And we're going to go in here on a special military operation and denazify this because they're paying homage to a guy that partnered with the Nazis. I just want to break it down that for the listeners, right, that geopolitics is incredibly complex, and you're often dealing with so many layers and hundreds of years sometimes. Well, honestly, in this case, hundreds of years, right, of ethnic and not necessarily ethnic cleansing, but lots of ethnicities and lots of languages going in. And John, there was some of that, but there's a lot of parts, and we in the West are really only getting a very, very small digestible pallet nugget of bullshit fed to us. When you really start reading these documents and looking into really the specifics of what's been going on in this region for let's even say the past like 30 years, it's astounding. There's a little nuggets of truth that you need to parse out yourself. And really, Nick, what you did in that article, which we will link, John, go ahead and link that too in the show notes. It's amazing. You broke it down. You broke down the atrocities from the other side. We're only seeing them but like obviously it doesn't get to this point if there hasn't been like shit hasn't been flung on both sides. So I wanted to put that out there, dude. And now you're bring us home, brother. Bring us home.
Yeah. So John was saying that Crimea is classically part of the Turkic Empire. Yeah, Russia seized Crimea from the Turks, and that's actually interesting. So what Rick just mentioned, that we're only getting snippets. Here's another interesting snippet. In Crimea, there's a small, not small, decent-sized population of Tatars, which are like the traditional ethnic steppe people from there. Yeah. Stalin had a policy where he removed all the Tatars from Crimea, or most of them, and it was basically a genocide, more or less, because they were seen as Nazi collaborators. Then sometime in the 70s or the 80s, they were repopulated back to Crimea. And now the Tatars were actually very pro-Ukrainian because of traditionally what has been done to them by the Russians has not been good. So when they saw that Crimea was about to go to Russia again, they were like, oh, crap. So they're a population within Crimea, an ethnic minority, which is strongly pro-Ukrainian. So it's never a neat thing in like how you mentioned. So having laid out our battlegrounds in between East and West, we elect a man named Kuchma to the 2000 election. He wins, and he's your typical corrupt oligarch, that type of thing. So in the sort of the precipitating in 2004, there's going to be a presidential election, and sort of the precipitating problem that starts happening is that one of his bodyguards runs away and takes a bunch of tapes with him. One of his bodyguards has been taping him for years, and these are like Nixon-esque tapes that capture all sorts of political corruption, all sorts of nasty stuff. They have him like talking bad about NATO. They have him lending Putin several millions of dollars for Putin's original 2000 election. And then after Putin, from Ukrainian state banks legally. And then when Putin wins, Putin returns that fivefold. So shady deals like that, intimidation of opponents through the media. But here's the big one. There was a dissident journalist who was kidnapped, killed, set on fire. He was decapitated and buried somewhere outside of Kyiv in the 2000. And this is prior to the 2004 election. And so he was a dissident journalist. I think his name was Georgy Gungantse or something like that.
Okay,
Gungantse is definitely the last name. I know I'm butchering it.
No, don't worry.
So he was a dissident journalist. He had publicly questioned President Kuchma on TV. And he disappeared, was butchered, was set on fire. And in those tapes was the president discussing getting rid of this guy. Like, what can we do with him? Maybe we should have Chechens kidnap him. Maybe we should deport him to Georgia, where he's originally from. And so people hear this and instantly realize, oh shit, our president probably killed this journalist.
Yeah.
So 2004 is the first of the big revolutions, I guess, in Ukraine. And it pits this guy called Yushchenko versus this guy called Yanukovych. I know the names are complicated, Yushchenko, Yanukovych, but more or less Yanukovych is the guy that was in power before he was overthrown recently in 2014. What started all of this was Yanukovych getting overthrown. He's eventually going to win election. So Yanukovych is the hand-picked successor of this dirty president in the 2000s. And there's this guy running against him, a reformer called Yushchenko. And what happens is all the exit polls show that Yushchenko is going to win. But when the election results are announced, he lost. And it's clear there was corruption. It's clear the administration cheated to get their own guy in there. And so what happens is something known as a color revolution. This one is the Orange Revolution. And there have been a bunch of color revolutions, around that area. Georgia had a color revolution, for example. And essentially what political scientists call a color revolution is a relatively bloodless transfer of power where mass protests and political leaders interject and manage to drive out whoever is in power. right?
Yep.
And so we love color revolutions because we see it as the people taking power and democratic accountability and all that. And the Russians hate color revolutions because they see it as part of a huge conspiracy to drive out anybody who supports them. Because sure, behind every color revolution is a lot of homegrown support, but it's also a bunch of American money, American pollsters, American advisors, NGOs. Like, for example, the Assistant Secretary of State to Europe, Victoria Nuland, is it Nuland? I think so. Bragged, I think, in early 2010 or late 2000s that we had spent something like $5 billion or $2 billion in Ukraine, right? And she said that openly. And when we hear that, we go like, oh, cool, right? Like, she said we spent that much to foster democracy in Ukraine. Now, when we hear that, we say fine. But to the Russian mind, when they if we were to hear, oh, Russia spent $5 billion in Ukraine to bolster their interests, well, the mind reels at what kind of disgusting things they could be planning. So one nation's, what was I about to say? Yeah, like one nation's fostering of something is another nation's subversion, more or less.
100%. 100%. It's meddling. It's meddling in their sphere of influence. Or like,
So I heard stories about the Orange Revolution was a legitimate event. It was a bunch of people taking the street in 2004, demanding that the government do another election. It goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides, yes, another election, and this time the right candidate wins.
Yep.
Yanukovych, not Yanukovych, Yushchenko wins.
Yushchenko wins. Yeah, because that's when, there's, I'm sure that we've all seen the images of the former president being evacuated to Russia on a helicopter.
Not yet. No, that's 2014.
That's
so this lays the ground, right?
Okay.
This lays the ground. This is an Orange Revolution. We saw an election happen. The people decided it was corrupt. The court decided it was corrupt. It was overturned. There was another guy in there. And it's part of a string of these color revolutions that have been popping up all around Russia's territory. So Russia, aside from NATO, is seeing something dark in this. They're seeing like the Soros Foundation and Open Democracy and these types of foundations fund these things. Like I heard stories from the Color Revolution that were like, the reason why it's called orange is because it was their party color. I heard stories that like it was raining and so like a van drove by and started handing out like orange umbrellas so the news could pick up on the orange and be like, oh, it's an Orange Revolution. Look what they're doing, right? So like stuff like that, which is funny, which obviously is like it's money pouring in from us to support a cause. So that happens. The guy that wins the election has like an awful time in office. Like he can't get anything off the ground. He can't unite the forces that brought him. And he has to deal with like the worldwide recession because he came to office in 2004. And, by 2007, the world is melting. Yep. So he can't even run again. And the guy that becomes president after him, Yanukovych, is the guy originally that he beat. So this guy that got thrown out of office is the guy that comes back. Now, Yanukovych is pro-Russian, right? More pro-Russian. Every single president balances the European Union and the United States and Russian, but Yanukovych is pro-Russian or more pro-Russian and is supported in the East. He wins with, like, if you look at an electoral map of Ukraine for this type of stuff, it looks like our elections, how the South votes for one candidate and like the North in California votes for another. That's what it looks like. It looks like the entire East voting for like the pro-Russian candidate and the West voting for another one. So Yanukovych comes to power. Now the inciting moment, the thing that sparks all of this is in 2014. And this is known as Euromaidan. Euromaidan is named after the park where they go protest. They go protest in their central square, and their central square is called Maidan. So in 2014, there's a trade deal put in front of Yanukovych from the European Union. And it's going to be the ability to join the European Union common market, right? So we know the EU has a common market where people and goods, people can flow freely without visas, and goods can flow freely without tariffs, right? So the EU offers this and says, okay, and down the road, we're going to give you an IMF loan of like some millions of dollars. Now, Ukraine is already part of this like Russian EU. I'm forgetting the name. It's CI something, but whatever. It's their own free trade zone among the post-Soviet states, heavily subsidized with Russian oil. And so he has this deal in front of him, and Putin counters and offers like a huge, several billion dollar loan for him to say no. And Yanukovych, who has made overtures saying before that, oh no, Ukraine will have a European future, seems like he's about to do and like even advisors of the European Union were already there trying to manage the transition, right? This was seen as like the first step to join the European Union. So it looked like it was going to be a done deal. And Yanukovych randomly announces, no, I looked at the deals. Putin's deal is better. We're not going to be doing this. And it wasn't even known, there wasn't even an attempt, like nobody knows whether the deals could have been made to work. Like nobody tried to be like, okay, can we be part of this zone? Can we be part of that zone? Nobody tried. So when he announces this, people take to the square. A shit ton of people, like hundreds of thousands of people march on the square. And from one of the participants, this is quoting a professor who was a participant, he himself admits that the deal was never to protest what was going on. The deal was either Yanukovych changes his mind and signs his pro-EU deal, or we're going to overthrow him. So it's like a very student-led protest. And, the protests happen, but he takes a television and he explains the two deals. And the Russian deal, in my opinion, is certainly the better deal. And he explains this, and eventually the protests start fizzling away. Until one day where the police descends on them at like 4 a.m, like a few hundred students that are like sleeping, and beat them.
Yep.
And so this is captured, it's put online, and all of a sudden, the protests suddenly have wind again. And more and more and more people take the streets. And essentially from November to February, it's massive protests in the square that eventually turn into bloodshed, right? Because there's already bloodshed going on. Basically, if leaders, like whenever leaders left the protest, like some of them vanish and are killed, some of them are kidnapped. So there's obviously shady stuff going from like the government side. So in February, what happens is they try to march on the parliament. And when they try to march on the parliament, someone, as always happens in these things, fires a shot, whether it was the police or whether it was the protesters. And then for 2 days, it turns into warfare, right? 100 people are killed in the capital. What causes the most media attention are snipers. There are snipers in buildings that straight up shoot protesters. And so 103 people, like think about it, over the entirety of the entire BLM protests, like 12 to 20 people died. And those that were actually killed by police were like maybe 5 or 4. And that's over like an entire summer of rioting. Whereas in 2 days here in the capital, 103 people die. So it's like an insane thing. And when this happens, on top of the government passing already like a bunch of dictatorial laws where they can throw you in jail if you... sorry, I was reading the chat. Where they can throw you in jail if like you protest wrong. The president does something presidents don't do, very weird, and he takes a sick leave. He just says, you know what, I'm taking a sick leave, I'm heading out, and he goes to the fucking Olympics to like meet with Putin. He goes to the Sochi Olympics, he takes a sick leave, he comes back in time to like preside over like the killing of like 100 people, and he flees to Russia. So this is what you were talking about. First, he flees to like his home region, which I think is Donetsk, actually. It's either Donetsk or Luhansk. He flees to his home region, seeing if anybody supports him. And they're like, dude, after you killed 100 people, we really can't be behind you. So then he flees to Russia. And instantly, the protesters take over, depose the entire cabinet, depose the president, institute their own interim president, announce that elections would be coming up. And this is known as Euromaidan revolution.
At Donetsk. Or Donbass? Donbass or Donetsk? Donetsk?
Donbass is like the name of the larger region.
Yeah, Donbass is where
Donetsk and Luhansk are.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right.
So that's Euromaidan, and that's the pro-Western revolution that causes the war in 2014. Okay, so now we're finally at the conflict. We're finally at that conflict in 2014. There were a lot of things about that conflict that Russia didn't like. Let's start. The ambassador that I mentioned previously, Victoria Nuland, was out in the streets handing like cookies and food to protesters to make sure they didn't leave. John McCain and other senators, before the shooting had ever started, flew to Ukraine and spoke publicly and said, what we're trying to do here is a peaceful transition of power. They admitted to wanting regime change before the shooting had started. And remember, Yanukovych is a democratically elected president. He won fair and square. And the weirdest of all were those snipers I mentioned. Mm-hmm. Because the snipers wasn't the government firing. It was right-wing militias among the protesters, right? Because times of conflict make weird bedfellows. And so, of course, if you're going to be in an anti-Russian movement for a nationalist movement, you're going to end up with right-wing allies. So the snipers were actually Ukrainian ultra-nationalist right-wingers firing on protesters to escalate the conflict. It was a false flag attack that got entirely blamed on the Ukrainian government forces. And there was actually an independent paper like analyzing gigabytes and gigabytes of photos and videos and all of that, an academic one that's yet to be refuted.
Saboteurs.
So very weird shit. So Russia instantly sees this and they go, oh, okay, they just overthrew a democratically elected government. We don't like this. At the same time, the provinces that I was mentioning, the Donbass region and Crimea, also start not liking this. Again, the guy they just chose just got overthrown. And Crimea, particularly, a lot of the troops that did fire on people in the capital, because it wasn't just sniper fire, it was also their special troops, their Berkut, which is like their military police. A bunch of them were Crimeans. And so in Crimea, just as the pro-EU protesters struck in the capital very quickly, in Crimea, pro-Russian people, with a lot of Russian nationals there, because a lot of Russians live in Crimea already, since Sevastopol, like ports are leased to the Russians throughout the years, strike and take over a city. So right away, Crimea thinks, oh shit, there's going to be reprisal from the capital. What do? As early as February 6th, which is the president fled on the 22nd or 23rd. So even before the president fled, Crimea is considering, the Crimean parliament is considering asking Russia for help. Then, something called little green men start appearing all over Crimea, which are not aliens, but like dudes dressed in green. And they're very polite, but they don't answer where they're from or who they are. And now we know they're Russian soldiers.
Yeah.
And so Russian soldiers, little green men, start appearing all over Crimea. Within days after the president flees, they take over the Crimean parliament. They impose a pro-Russian parliament over Crimea, and they have that parliament officially draft a letter to Putin asking for help. And so Putin goes to the Duma and says, okay, can I bring troops to Crimea? He asks for official permission. Of course, the Duma says yes, which is stupid because he had already sent troops into Crimea. So, the man does as he please. And within days, Crimea falls to the Russians. There is no fighting, right? Because Crimea, there's like a large possibility that if left to their own devices after the revolution, Crimea would have voted in favor of reunification with Russia.
Yeah.
But when Russia rolls their tanks in, right, and they introduce a referendum which says, okay, do you want to be an autonomous Republic of Ukraine, or do you want to join Russia? And like the numbers come back like 98% join Russia. Obviously a falsified poll, like the Ukrainian media wasn't allowed to look. Like we have accounts of like ballot stuffing. Like, it doesn't mean that Crimea wouldn't have wanted to join Russia. It just means that the referendum was illegitimate and false and done at duress and at gunpoint. Yes. So Crimea joins Russia right away. Then Donetsk and Luhansk, which are the two areas that have the most pro-Russian sentiment, start taking essentially start being inspired by Crimea's example, and they do the same thing. Pro-Russian protesters take over the government buildings. Militias start forming. These are paramilitaries. A bunch of like Russian adventurers, like vets from the Afghanistan war, and like college students start coming in and like also joining these Ukrainian paramilitaries, and they all have funny nicknames. Like this dude who used to work at Radio Shack and used to like do telecommunications in Afghanistan has the nickname like Motorola. They use like social media a lot. They're led by this Russian guy called Strelkov, who I think is also a vet. So
how the fuck do you know all this?
I've read a shit ton of this. I've read basically everything there is to read in about Crimea and like this region. I've read.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah,
I was gonna say the guy you said. What was the commander's name?
Strelkov.
What was it? Is that like Strelnikov, like from Dr. Zhivago? That's the friend of Lara, I think, that joins the Bolsheviks.
I don't think so. No, that's Strelnikov, right?
Yeah.
No, this guy's Strelkov, but Strelkov also isn't his name. I forget his real name. Okay. One of those dudes. They also have like anime names too. Like I forget. Like one of those dudes is like Uchiha or Sasuke or something like that. Like some Russian guy has that nickname. So these paramilitaries, which are very flashy, start forming, and they engage in open combat with the Ukrainian army. So like right away, they start trying to take territory, and they do their own referendums. And in the referendums, they declare themselves independent. They declare themselves the People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Luhansk. And so in response to this, the Ukrainian government passes a law and says they're all terrorists and authorizes its own militias to form. And so this is where we get the infamous Azov Battalion, right?
The Nazis.
Yeah, this is where we get the Nazis. So the Azov Battalion is one of these like flashy militias. It started out as a neo-Nazi group. Its leader was elected to parliament sometime after Euromaidan in like 2014 or 2015. And even then, when he's like trying to like clean up the group, he even admits publicly that it's anywhere from 10 to 20% neo-Nazi. Which if that's like the number you think you can get away with, that's pretty funny. So it's like good. It's clear that like it's a heavy neo-Nazi influence group. And if they're not explicitly neo-Nazi, then it's certainly fellow travelers. It's people who might not be Nazis, but are certainly very right-wing. And again, this is on both sides. Like it's not like the Russians don't have any Nazis. Like this is Eastern Europe. Like these are people who have political opinions to the right of Attila the Hun.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, though, I'm going to take a pause here, a little bit of comedic relief. How the fuck do you think that conversation went? Like, listen, guys, listen. I've got a bunch of dudes that are ready to roll. Really, you can fight this threat. Yeah. But anywhere between 15 to 20, maybe 10, they're Nazis. They're Nazis. Like Z Kyle Nazi. Well, yeah, I mean, yes, they're that skinheads. Maybe little less. How the fuck? I just don't understand. Like, go ahead, John.
What's a few Nazis between friends?
What's a few Nazis?
Strange
everyone has that weird.
Right?
Everyone has that weird racist uncles. Just think that a bunch of them just got together and formed a club.